On to our next book. It's Fight Night. So, Kieran, you've been reading this.
Yeah, actually, much like Fiona, I would not have read this probably myself. The example I gave, speaking to her earlier, was it's the type of book I'd find myself reading in a book club. You know, someone else might nominate it. I wouldn't pick it up off the shelf myself. It's about these three generations of one family, all women. So Swiv, who is a 9-year-old who has been expelled from school or suspended from school, she's been sent home. Her mother, who is an out of work single mom, she is an actress and she's pregnant. And then because Swiv is sent home from school, the mum asks her mother to come and live with them and help with the kind of the child rearing duties, as it were, given that she's heavily pregnant. She's in her third trimester. And the grandmother, Elvira, is she's on death's door, essentially. Like, she's one foot in the grave is how they describe it. She's got heart problems, she's deaf, she needs a huge amount of medication every day. And it's a family that's really, it's deeply, deeply touched by tragedy. You know, there's suicide and abandonment and all of that kind of feeds into the title and the theme about the fight that they kind of continually find themselves in. Having said all of that, it's a really, really funny book. It's hilarious. And actually a little bit, kind of like Fiona with Boys Don't Cry, it's told through Swiv, the 9-year-old girl, mostly. It later in the book, a bit of it is through the grandmother, but it's mostly through Swiv, to letters to her absent father, who is off fighting the fascists, whatever that means. Anyway, and she's trying to interpret, I guess, all of the things that are going on in her world, the good and the bad. And if I can just read a little bit of it. So she's talking about her mother being pregnant. Her mother is I'm going to kind of draw the ire here of women up and down the country, but she's probably too old to be pregnant, or she would have thought she was too old to be pregnant. And Swiv's understanding is that impregnating mom was like creeping up to the edge of an active volcano that you accidentally thought was inactive. And then she describes the pregnancy. She says, mom is having a complete nervous breakdown and a geriatric pregnancy, which doesn't mean she's going to push an old geezer out of her. It just means she's too old to be up the stump. And it continues in that vein. Like, if there was a criticism of it, it maybe there's too much of it at times, too much of that humour. You'd like there to be maybe the mother's voice or the grandmother's voice to interrupt and interpret it from an adult's point of view the odd time, but it's still really successful the way I suppose we all fall into patterns of behaviour, and we all fall into patterns of interpretation as well. And having a 9-year-old girl actually interpret these really serious issues forces you as a reader out of your own comfort zone and your own patterns of interpretation, and forces you maybe to reappraise things. And the book gets quite dark in the second half. And at the same time, the second half of the book is actually the funniest part as well, because they go on this road trip down to Fresno, and it gets utterly ludicrous what Swiv and her grandmother get up to. But like that, it's not a book that I necessarily would have picked up, but it's a brilliant book. It's really, really funny. And that juxtaposition, I think, of the humour, even though there's maybe a bit too much the odd time, but overall the juxtaposition of that humour with the situation they find themselves in is worked really well. It kind of heightens the sense of tragedy and everything that this family, that these three generations have had to deal with. And that's what the theme, like Fight Night, there is this kind of underlying theme the whole way through it of all of these women, and I suppose by extension women, like just fighting against maybe the prevailing currents in their lives, and the prevailing currents are kind of drifting them in all the wrong directions. In this, I mentioned like there's abandonment and there's suicide. There's themes, because I didn't know anything about Miriam Toews, I have to say. I know there's lots of fans of her out there. But she comes back to these themes, it seems, in a lot of her books. And she's from a Mennonite community, which are kind of like Amish, as far as I understand, but not really, not totally Amish, but kind of half Amish. I've kind of insulted all the Mennonites watching, but I'm not sure how many there are in Ireland. Floyd Landis, the Tour de France cyclist, he was a Mennonite, wasn't he? The guy who got caught cheating. Anyway, I digress. Anyway, it's kind of but you can imagine the Amish community. It's quite a restrictive community. It's quite patriarchal and all of that. And that's kind of a theme that comes through in this. That kind of push back against it. And the Mennonites feature in this, and they feature, I understand, in lots of her other books. So it is a book that like I say, I absolutely would not pick this book up off the shelf of my own volition. But I really enjoyed it. And
as well, I think we love dark humour. We just seem to love dark humour.
Yeah, and there's plenty of it. Like I mentioned that, I actually I sanitized that sentence a little bit, given, there might be little ears listening to this. There's plenty of dark humour in it. And as I say, the latter half of the book during this road trip is when it gets darkest and when it gets funniest.